All right, continuing with Module 2, now with a focus on designing report layouts and setting dynamic properties. So each report that you develop always has a body, and optionally we can add headers and footers. And you'll find these on the Insert Ribbon tab, the ability to add or remove a header and footer. The deal is this: the header will repeat on every page and the footer will repeat on every page. I think you do have a property that says exclude the first page.
That is true.
Your first page might be different. So let's focus then now on the report itself. The way that I think of a report design or an RDL file, it's actually hierarchical. The report is the top level, and then you've got the regions of header, body, and layout, and then we can add objects into them. You can even add objects into those objects. So my thinking is it's hierarchical. And the very root is the report object. So what we can do with the report object is we can configure properties like the page units, inches or centimeters. It will use regional settings to adapt to what makes sense to where you are.
But inches is always right.
I'm Australian, and I would tend to disagree. Page orientation comes next. Now, this becomes important if you know that the report is intended for printing to a particular page size. So this is where we configure the orientation. Is it portrait? Is it landscape? The size. And you'll find that there are built-in sizes like A4.
Or letter.
What that means in Australia, by the way, is that's the typical business page, but letter here in the US. Or if you choose to customize, then you can configure precise pixel width.
And there's actually a lot of people who use custom width and heights for things like printing out name tags and things like that. So they do very small regions in the page and they have that repeat. So it's interesting just how many of these features people use in unique ways.
Right. Now next is the consideration for margins. Top, bottom, left, and right, you can configure these as well. Now this brings us to the topic of, well, how much space do we have to lay out our data on the report? And it really is just a matter of mathematics. When you think about it, if the dimensions of your page are fixed by the size of your paper, and then you've got the height of your header and footer, if they're enabled, well, that tells you what you need to subtract.
That's right.
And then you've got the margins to consider as well. You know, have a ½ an inch at the top and the bottom, and you can come to the precise width and height of what your body needs to be if it has to render to a single page.
Yep.
All right. What we find with beginners is that if you don't quite get these properties right, and it can be frustrating until you understand the way Report Builder works, is that they really have to be precise. And the moment that your width is slightly over the available width of the page, then it will result in probably blank pages being output.
Yes, and we've all been there. I can tell you when you first get started with the tool, you will have times that it can be challenging, but I think that one of the great things about this video and this idea of having a template to get started with is once you configure this once, and if you're really focusing on that print scenario, you can continue to use that template again and again to not have to worry about that going forward.
So beyond those properties for the report layout itself, in fact, those properties are available in a properties page, so they're really easy to open and then set them up front. There are some additional properties that you'll find only in the properties pane. The author and description and more metadata. The language can control formatting, in fact, and currency symbols.
Yes.
You can lay out multi-column reports.
That's right.
Background color and maybe adding an image to the background. It's not a personal favorite of mine, in fact, but I have seen a nice use of like ghosted images like a watermark.
Yes, watermark's a big one.
Right, and so this is where you would configure it for the report itself. And I think Paginated Report Bear likes this large property, right, the last property, and may well have contributed to your success.
That's true.
When competing against Will Thompson.
That's true. I did show him up that way. But yes, auto refresh has been around quite some time in the RDL definition, and in fact, it was developed for a hackathon. It was a side project that one of the developers did and actually made it into the product.
So by default, it's set to 0 seconds. It means you won't have auto refresh. But if you configure beyond 0, then it will auto load when the user is viewing it in the Power BI service.
That's right. They'll see the latest data at all times.
Now, there's an additional topic here, and I'm going to keep it brief for the purpose of this introductory video course, but there is the concept of report variables that you can define to store values. They can be set to read only or set to read write, and there are particular and often advanced design reasons for using these variables. For completeness, I will introduce them here, but we won't be talking about them or using them any further. Report objects come next. So having ensured that you've got the headers and footers on and that they're the right dimensions, your paper size and orientation and such forth are in place, we're now ready to consider placing objects onto the canvas itself. So if you recall, there is the Insert Ribbon tab, and there was actually 3 groupings. We had the data regions, the data visualizations, and report items. Now, we'll talk about data regions and visualizations later because they're connected to data, and we haven't yet talked about how we're retrieving data in detail.
That's true.
So let's focus on this group that you'll find on the Insert Ribbon tab known as the report items. They are the text box, the image, the line, and rectangle. And they can be added to your page, and they can be independent of data that's retrieved from your data sources. The text box is the most commonly used object in a report design. And its purpose is typically to display some text value. Now, that text could be static, or it could be based on an expression.
That's true.
That at rendering time, it dynamically retrieves, possibly from your data, the value that needs to be displayed.
Yeah, I think expressions are one of those things when you get started, you get hesitant to use them, but as you become more advanced, you find they are incredibly valuable and powerful in terms of what they can do.
Well, if you think expressions, think Excel.
Yes,
Does a cell in a worksheet have a constant value, or if it needs to dynamically produce a value, commence with the equal symbol, and then followed by an expression?
Yeah, that's actually a great example of how.
So it's almost identical.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, the text box is much more interesting than what you might first think when you see it.
Exactly.
Right, like a cell in a worksheet is a single value, but the text box is really, or potentially, a collection of placeholders.
Yes, it can do a lot of stuff in a text box.
And these placeholders could be static values or driven through expressions. Now, the best example I think we've got is a mail merge.
Yes, that's a good one.
In a single text box, you could have, dear customer, thank you for purchasing products from us. We look forward and anyway, you can inject through placeholders and also control formatting.
Yes.
And so you've got rich text options and the ability to produce a layout like a mail merge.
Yeah, exactly. And having that dynamic name to go in there with the static text is really, really powerful.
And there's one other property which I love, and I use this a fair bit, that if your source data actually has HTML tags in it for styling purposes, colors and emphasis with bold, and that's the way it's stored in your data, you can configure the placeholder to render that HTML to give you rich text formatting.
Yeah. And that's something that a lot of Power BI authors look for today in the desktop tool, and they can do here in Power BI Report Builder.
The similarities with the cell in a worksheet continue. So when it comes to formatting properties, what you can do with a cell, like font, color, size, weight, borders, colors, backgrounds, padding, will it grow if the data value, is lengthy?
It can.
It can.
It can.
So I think by default it will, but you may not want that. So
Yes.
you can turn the can grow off.
Yes.
And there might be reasons that you want to hide it under certain circumstances.
Very
so there's
true.
a visibility property as well.
It's interesting. A lot of people actually ask for that ability to hide or show certain fields in the Power BI report, and you can absolutely do that in the Paginated report. So again, this is one of these education things.
Right, and stay tuned because when we talk about interactivity, one of those capabilities is achieved through visibility.
Yep.
Now, the next item is the image, classically used to display your company logo. So the image is a standalone image, and yet the image could be retrieved from 3 different places.
That's true.
All right, so
Oh yeah, you can have it on a web server embedded within the report, so you just load the image in there, and from a database. So that's one of the examples that people often look for was, hey, I have this saved as a file in my database itself, and so I can just choose that field and have it show when I choose each of my records, and you have a different image.
I have a feeling the AdventureWorks company does just that.
I have a feeling it does as well.
My preference, by the way, is that you store it once, if you can, on a web server. Simply because when your logo changes, you don't need to open lots of reports and change an embedded image. So if it's practical to do so, and you'd want to be careful because if the Power BI reports were going to be accessed outside the organization, it would have to be a public-facing URL that would work. But if you can get that working, and maybe it's your company's public website, and you use that URL, to me, that's the best way to go. That if that changes in the future, then your report simply will retrieve the latest logo. All right, so image use could be freestanding, like in your header of your report. They could be pictures associated with rows of data when being retrieved from your data source. Or they could be the background of other report items, including the report body, a text box, rectangle, table matrix, or list.
Yeah, I would say that I'm with you. I don't generally use images in the backgrounds of those scenarios, but again, you absolutely can do that. You have full control.
Often in my thinking, less is more when it comes to the presentation of your data. Because you can do it doesn't mean you have
Yes,
to.
doesn't mean you
Is that
should.
right?
That's true.
From my experience, this is the most least used, if that's the right way to put it, the line. A line is basically that. It's a line that allows for visual interest. The only time I might consider using it is in a demo, or if I need a diagonal line, because often the easiest way to control a line is just to use a border on a text box.
That's very true. Yeah, I don't use lines very often either.
And then we come to the fourth, which is actually very interesting. The rectangle, of course, if you want a rectangle or a square, by the way,
Yes.
then for visual interest, you could add it and you could control its borders and colors. However, the rectangle is actually a container.
Yes.
And so therefore, we can place other items inside the rectangle itself.
Yeah, the rectangle is incredibly powerful. Also, the rectangle is incredibly powerful, so you have to be very, very careful when you're using a rectangle. So it's one of those things that as you start become more proficient using Report Builder, you'll find it gives you enormous flexibility to do certain things in terms of grouping and layout. But you do have to be careful because if you don't remember that you have a rectangle behind it, you get yourself in trouble very quickly.
Yeah,
in terms of
if its
layout.
color is white or transparent,
Yes.
you won't know it's there.
Yes.
So a couple of things to say about it. I mentioned that the report is actually a hierarchical structure. And so the container is like a folder in that.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
All right, so beyond just a visual rectangle, it's a container. And the reason you might use it, by the way, is that if you've got a lot of items and you want to keep them together,
Yes.
place them in a rectangle. And when you move the rectangle, the items maintain their relative position within the rectangle. So it can work just as a visual design. Your report users won't see it, but it will help you at design time. One other interesting thing to note about the rectangle is that the body, the header and the footer are special instances
Yes.
of a rectangle.
Yes.
All right. Let's move on to the second topic, using expressions. So it's very common in your report designs that expressions will be used to dynamically assign values, most commonly to the value of a text box.
Yep.
That's the way we display data back to the report reader. But in fact, we can apply properties, or rather expressions, to many other properties, styling and formatting. And so what I would say is that almost any property you can dynamically assign to, but not location and position. They need to be locked in at report design time. And notably also the data source itself. The data source and its connection is not dynamic, but a data set query is.
Yes.
So you've got an enormous amount of potential that at design time you can acknowledge that things are variable, and therefore an expression will solve this when the report is being rendered.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's an important thing. So Peter brings up the data source not being dynamic. You could do dynamic data sources with SSRS for many years. That's not yet available in the Power BI service, but it is something we're hearing people ask about and looking for as we move forward. So thank you for bringing that up, Peter.
You're welcome, Chris. All right. Now, when you build out your expression, you could use a variety of .NET namespaces. So programmers are familiar with this, a very rich library of capabilities relevant to programming. Now, we're not programming here in a report design, but there are many functions that can support us to produce the results that we need. No different to the Excel expressions that refer to Excel functions.
Exactly.
Now, if you want to get into more complex logic, then the report will support this through a code block. Let's talk about the code block in more detail shortly. All right, so we've made mention that expressions are assigned to properties, and there is a particular window that's going to support you constructing a valid expression. You can often launch this either from the properties pane or directly from a properties page, or sometimes even by right-clicking an item on the canvas. And what this window does, once launched, and here's an example of an FX button that we click to open the window, or in the properties pane, you might set a property to an expression. Now, what that will do is open the expression window. Take note at the top left. Remember, you can assign expressions to lots of different properties. So it's telling us, in this example, that it's setting the property for the hidden property. In the box beneath it is an expression. Take care here, the beginner's trap is that if it's an expression, it must always commence with equals.
That's right.
If it doesn't, then it's a constant value.
Yes.
So again, no different from Excel. In the lower part of the expression window then, you'll see in the left, there's the category. It's actually like a tree list control. This presents to you all of the resources, including built-in fields, we'll talk about them in a moment, parameters, your dataset fields, variables, operators, and common functions in the expression language that you might use to construct your expression.
Yeah.
Now, what I like about it for beginners, Chris, is that when you select from common functions, you'll see that there's a description and an example provided to you.
Yes.
So this tool doesn't expect you to be a proficient developer, but it will provide you, enormous capabilities with expressions and hold your hand to help guide you through producing what you need.
Or your paw.
Or your paw. Yeah. So let's take a look at the built-in fields. There are globals, there is the render format and user. Let's just focus on a few of the commonly used ones.
Yep.
Chris mentioned page numbering, very common in the footer of your report, and also total pages. The report name, I like this one. We can output an expression that says what is the report name, because when you publish a report to the Power BI service, you can rename it.
That's true.
And there's nothing more frustrating than opening the sales order report to see that the title of the report is different. Very confusing. So often the text box that is the title of your report will output the report name global.
Yep.
We made mention of the user ID is there as well, so we know who the authenticated user is. So these are all of the resources. A quick note that some of them behave differently in Report Builder to how they will behave when published to the Power BI service.
Yeah, I think the user ID one is the biggest one, and that's very similar to what you see with Power BI Desktop, is that if you're using a user ID field, when you're using it locally, you're using the account name that you're logged into your machine with, but when you publish it up to the service, it's using a UPN, because again, it's based on Azure Active Directory and the UPN name, so it's the mine is chris@microsoft.com or whatever. And so you just have to be careful there, especially if you're doing things like row-level security scenarios or things like that, exactly what you're trying to match on as we move forward.
Right, so you've gone to all this effort, you've tested it on desktop, you've published it to the service. So do bear that in mind. So user ID is one that you must take note of. For me, the execution time is the other one. So it's quite common in the footer of your report that you want to convey when that report was generated. At development time on your desktop with Report Builder, it will be local time. When you publish it, and as is the case for all cloud services, it will be your coordinated universal time, or UTC.
Yes.
It could be a little bit tricky to come up with an expression if you've got users all around the world.
That's very
to
true.
translate that to local time. But if you're fortunate enough to have them in a single time zone, you might find a way to get around that by adding or subtracting a static number of hours. Or what I've done is the easiest thing. When I convey the report time at the bottom, I put UTC next to it.
No, that's a good idea.
All right, so that way there's no confusion.
That's a very good idea.
One other thing to note, we'll point this out in the next video with a demonstration, is the report name returns nothing when you're previewing it.
That's very true.
But have faith in it. When it's published to the service, it will in fact return the name of the report.
That's true.
Okay, when it comes to building up expressions, without getting too detailed, we see an example, in fact 3 examples, that will return the value of the sales field. They all achieve exactly the same outcome, but they just do it differently, and this is the way that VB.NET as a language works. What you'll find is that when you automatically set up expressions using the expression builder, often by double-clicking the field, and it will inject a reference into your expression, it'll use the first one. Fields, !sales.value. It literally means from the fields collection, get the sales item and the value property of the sales item. The note that I've included in the slides, really important, is that any references to items and names in your report are case sensitive. So if sales has a capital S, then you need to use a capital S. If it's lowercase s, you'll need to use lowercase s.
Yes.
All right, here's some examples. So we've already mentioned conveying the report name at the top of the report. This is how we do it. The expression for the text box is equals globals collection, give me the report name. Next, page numbering, the concatenation of literal text to global variables. And there we see the report execution details. And we have a format function. The F, I think, means long format. So take the execution time, convert it to a string in long format. And by the way, there are lots of different format codes you can use to get the exact format that you acquire, and then you see the UTC appended. I like the last example, and in fact, we'll see this in a later demonstration. Conditional formatting is also achieved. This time the expression is assigned to a color property, and according to a value of the profit field. If it's less than 0, return red, otherwise return black.
I often use the switch statement as well for things like this. So if I have a number of items I need to use, I use switch.
All right, so if you're nesting ifs, consider switch as a better alternative. Let's just wrap up on the last topic then. The report itself has a code block that if you want to build much more complex programming logic, you can do so by using VB.NET. That means you've got the full capability of looping and whatever .NET can achieve for you. So this is a more advanced design concept, but I love the idea that a report can do this.
Yeah, in fact, I know some folks in our field organization and some of the MVPs have been interested in leveraging Azure Functions as part of this, which you can do with the Power BI service. So one of the examples that I'm aware of is that people have used Azure Functions to do translations. So they've used Azure Functions embedded in the report to call back to a translation service and then actually translate the report as people view it.
Well, how do we do this? So if you open up the report property pages, you'll find there's a dedicated page called the code page.
Yep.
You've just got a big box. Sadly, it doesn't provide you IntelliSense or all of those wonderful capabilities, so perhaps you'll create that logic in a tool like VS Code or Visual Studio, and once you've tested it, you'll copy and paste it in. And the way that you can then refer to your functions within the code block is like what you see here. Equals code dot the name of your function, and then if it takes parameters, you'll pass values in. So that brings us to the end of the theory for designing report layouts. Stay tuned, because the next video we're going to apply much of what we've just discussed in developing a report template that's going to allow us to quick start the development of our reports moving forward.